Good evening. Welcome to Newcastle University's public lecture series, Insights. My name is Martin Farr. I'm co-chair of the programme. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you to our latest in the Insights scheduled this year. We have, this evening's lecture is by Professor Catherine Rottenberg of Nottingham University. The title is The Rise of Neoliberal Feminism. I'll be back at about 6:05 to deal with questions that you may want to ask our speaker. There are two ways in which you can pose questions. One is on the chat box on your YouTube screen. The other is via Twitter. Our handle is @InsightsNCL. And if you put your questions through those two routes, we'll make sure that the speaker hears them. The introducer for the speaker this evening is Dr Marina Yusupova.
Good evening, and welcome to the Insight virtual public lecture series. I'm Marina Yusupova, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Newcastle University Business School. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Professor Catherine Rottenberg. Catherine is an associate professor of American and Canadian Studies at Nottingham University. She is the author of several books and edited collections. Tonight, Catherine will discuss her most recent book, The Rise of Neoliberal Feminism, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. Neoliberal feminism is a new version of feminism that abandons the struggle against unjust gendered division of labor, that abandons key feminist terms such as equal rights and liberation, advocating instead for a life full of balance and happiness. The book offers insight into why more and more high-powered women such as Hillary Clinton, Ivanka Trump, Emma Watson, and Beyoncé identify as feminists in the mainstream media, and why in the past few years feminism has gained increasing visibility and even urgency. Catherine puts forward the compelling argument that neoliberalism may actually need feminism in order to solve the thorny issue of reproduction and care work. I hope you enjoy the lecture.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak as part of the Newcastle University's Insights Public Lectures program. In particular, I'd like to thank Marina, Stephanie, and Umberine. It's a real honor to be here, virtually. And it's a little strange to be pre-recording this lecture, but here it goes. First, I'm going to share my screen, and then I will proceed. What I'd like to do this evening is to first give a sense of the genesis of my project on neoliberal feminism. And then I'd like to give a very brief synopsis of some of the key or main arguments of my book. And finally, I would like to present a short section from one of the chapters, which examines Ivanka Trump's book, Women Who Work. So first, I want to just say a few words about how this project came to be in order to underscore the particular problematic that I was trying to understand and to theorize. So the first time I really began to think about the entanglement of neoliberalism with feminism was in 2012, and this, of course, was during the Obama era. However, as books do, it took me a few years to complete, and when I did complete my book in 2017, we had already entered the Trump era. During those 5 years, the social, cultural, and political landscape in the US had in many ways changed, and changed quite dramatically. One could say that in 2012, we had gotten used to what Nancy Fraser has called progressive neoliberalism. And then with the rise of Trump, we began to see a new configuration, neoliberalism converging with hyper-nationalism and shameless white supremacy. And one of the most difficult things about writing this book was that events simply refused to wait until I had processed them and theorized them. It's really always difficult to capture a particular moment, cultural moment, as it happens in real time, as it were. And this, of course, is particularly true when events unfold and continue to unfold so rapidly. So 2012, when the project began, I was on sabbatical in the United States. And this was precisely the year in which Anne Marie Slaughter's Why Women Still Can't Have It All was published in The Atlantic magazine. That piece, as perhaps some of you might recall, created a real stir, it generated heated debate, and it catapulted Slaughter, who is a former dean at Princeton and was also a top advisor to Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, into the national spotlight. In Why Women Still Can't Have It All, Slaughter comes out as a feminist and tries to give an account of why professional women are still finding it so difficult to balance career demands with their wish for an active home life. She claims that this difficulty arises due to social norms and the inflexibility of US workplace culture, which continue to privilege career advancement over family. Now, Slaughter's piece went on to become one of the most, if not the most, widely read essays in the history of the Atlantic. 2012-2013 was also the year in which COO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg's feminist manifesto, Lean In, was published and instantly became a bestseller, a New York Times bestseller. In Lean In, Sandberg also comes out as a feminist and urges women to reaffirm their commitment to work, insisting that this will provide women more choice about how to cultivate a felicitous work-family balance. Thus, all of a sudden, or so it seemed at the time, powerful and high-profile women were publicly identifying as feminists, something that we just hadn't seen in the past or hadn't seen in this form. And it was at that point that I began to read these manifestos very carefully. Now, I'm trained as a literary critic, so for me, reading Slaughter and later Sandberg was an exercise in close textual analysis. And I was struck at the time by a number of rhetorical aspects, but perhaps most of all by the circulation of what I came to see as a new feminist vocabulary, where happiness, balance, particularly work-family balance, and lean in were replacing key terms traditionally inseparable from public feminist discussions and debates, namely autonomy, rights, and liberation. I also found it fascinating that in the wake of these publications, more and more high power and celebrity women were coming out as feminists. Thus, given cultural critics Angela McRobbie and Rosalind Gill's influential arguments about post-feminism and the entrenchment of a post-feminist sensibility in mainstream and popular Anglo-American culture, which they convincingly argue had been doing such a good job in disavowing or repudiating the need for feminism, the question with which I became preoccupied as I was writing the book was, how can we explain the resuscitation of a feminist discourse, what I argue as a new feminist discourse in mainstream and popular culture? And then I began to realize that in order to really understand the kind of cultural work that this new variant of feminism was carrying out, a number of factors needed to be taken into account. The first factor was simply the surge in feminist discourse in popular and mainstream venues in the US, but also in the UK. So in stark contrast to 2010, a decade ago, the F word today is literally everywhere. From the mainstream print media to popular television shows through New York Times best-selling films like best-selling books like Lean In, and of course, let's not forget former Prime Minister Theresa May. So the second factor is this mainstreaming and popularization has often gone hand in hand with defanging feminism, and particularly mainstream liberal feminism, of its oppositional potential. As many scholars have already demonstrated, more than simply being popularized, feminist themes have increasingly dovetailed and indeed converged with dominant ultra-nationalist ideologies and conservative forces across the globe. And then finally, the final factor, which has occurred more recently, is the resurgence of mass feminist mobilization, which in many ways differs from neoliberal feminism. And I'm going to return to this last factor in my concluding remarks. But just to make sure I'm not misunderstood, I'm not saying that feminist resistance on the ground disappeared at any moment in time, or that all feminist discourse has been defanged. Clearly, this is not the case. But in my work, I've been both fascinated and disturbed by the way in which feminism has been enfolded into mainstream common sense and into mainstream common sense in the popular media in the US over the past now decade, and how identifying as a feminist has become a source of social and cultural capital and a mark of pride for an increasing number of highly visible and powerful women of all political stripes in the United States. This was the problematic with which I became preoccupied. In my research then, I posit that we've witnessed the emergence of a new variant of feminism in the US, which I also claim revolves centrally around the notion of a happy work-family balance. Balance has not only been incorporated into the social imagination as a cultural good, but has helped to engender a new model of emancipated womanhood, a professional woman able to balance a successful career with a satisfying family life. A happy work-family balance, in other words, has been represented as a progressive feminist ideal. This new feminist ideal must not only be understood as helping to shape women's desires, aspirations, and behavior, but also, as I try to show in my book, as producing a feminist subject informed through and through by market metrics. And here are just a few examples of the ways in which balance has inserted itself as an ideal. So this, in short, is what I term neoliberal feminism. This is a feminism that has been unsettlingly unmoored from key terms such as equality, justice, emancipation, or autonomy. Neoliberal feminism disavows the socioeconomic and cultural structure shaping our lives, spawning a feminist subject who accepts full responsibility for her own well-being and self-care, which are predicated on crafting a felicitous work-family balance, which in turn itself is based on a cost-benefit calculus. So as might already be clear, I'm following political theorists Michelle Fair and Wendy Brown, who understand neoliberalism not merely as an economic system or a set of policies that facilitate intensified privatization and deregulation, but as a dominant political rationality or a normative form of reason that moves to and from the management of the state to the inner workings of the subject, recasting individuals as entrepreneurial and capital-enhancing agents. Neoliberal rationality extends a specific formulation of economic values, practices, and metrics to every dimension of human life, recasting and transforming human subjects into human capital. I also suggest in my work that neoliberalism may actually need feminism to resolve, at least temporarily, one of its internal tensions in relation to gender. As an economic order, neoliberalism relies on reproduction and care work in order to reproduce and maintain human capital. Yet on the other hand, as a political rationality, and in contrast to liberalism, neoliberalism has no lexicon that can recognize, let alone value, reproduction and care work. So the paradigmatic neoliberal subject is not gendered or raced, but generic. And this subject, like everything else, including our political imagination, is reduced to market metrics and converted into a spec of capital. And what particularly distinguishes neoliberalism from liberalism, as scholars have already underscored, is that under neoliberalism, different registers, political, economic, social, and affective, collapse, and all forms of valuation and evaluation transpire through a cost-benefit metrics. So the disappearance of a distinctive political lexicon is not only due to human subjects being increasingly converted into generic human capital, where gender is disavowed, but also because the division of the public-private spheres informing liberal thought and the traditional gender division of labor is being eroded through the conversion of everything into capital and the infiltration of a market rationality into all spheres of our lives, including the most private ones. So this is, in a nutshell, my theoretical framework, which I develop in my book, and then I use it to read Ivanka Trump's Women Who Work, Rewriting the Rules of Success. So now I want to turn to Ivanka Trump's text. Here it is. When Ivanka Trump's How to Succeed Guide, Women Who Work, was released in May 2017, it generated a flurry of angry reviews in the mainstream media. Many commentators excoriated the book, claiming that this newest Having It All manifesto was nothing more than artless jargon, which could just as easily have been found when Googling inspirational quotes. And yet, notwithstanding the widespread criticism, Women Who Work became a New York Times bestseller. Now, it is certainly true that Women Who Work is littered with decontextualized cliches and unabashedly endorses the Ivanka lifestyle brand. But what I want to argue here is that Trump's manifesto warrants serious analysis because it captures and reproduces a key contemporary and neoliberal expectation that individuals, and particularly women, should never cease working on themselves in order to enhance their value as human capital. So Trump's main message, and the one that serves as her repetitive mantra, is that women should work on all facets of their lives, their, quote, career, relationship, family, friendships, hobbies, and passions, end quote. The address is directed, not surprisingly, towards so-called aspirational women who are incited to achieve their best self, both professionally and personally. Success is defined as facing obstacles with resilience, with initiative and creativity, while one's ability to thrive is described as, quote, limited only by one's own hunger, drive, passion, and execution, end quote. So according to Trump, empowerment and achievement involve individual women consciously choosing to create the life they desire and proactively crafting such a life through continuous labor and perseverance. Precisely because women who work captures and reproduces a key contemporary and neoliberal expectation that individuals, and again, particularly women, should never cease working on themselves in order to enhance their value, this is why the manifesto deserves serious attention. I suggest that it lays bare the intensive labor, affective and physical, that women are expected to invest in themselves in order to approximate the contemporary norm of female, and here I will argue neoliberal feminist accomplishment. The ideal female subject is not only conceived of as human capital, however, but a closer examination of women in work also reveals how the self is produced as well as produces itself as an individual firm or as a business enterprise, where all activities and practices are understood as investments that aim to appreciate the value of the self as firm. Trump's text, in other words, encourages women to consider themselves as a form of stock, where their normative role is to augment their market value. This, of course, entails incessant labor, particularly the modification of behavior, aspirations, and affective orientation, much like a corporation that alters its practices in an attempt to increase its stock value by becoming more efficient. The woman as stock framework, in effect, conjures the ultimate neoliberal feminist subject, one shorn of any and all liberal trappings. So not unlike some of the other best-selling neoliberal feminist manifestos, such as Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, Trump clearly states her conviction that working towards greater gender equality is of paramount importance, while explicitly acknowledging that gender parity has yet to be reached in the US. So in her introductory chapter, Trump declares that despite the progress and the many advances women have made since her mother's generation, quote, we've still got a long way to go, end quote. Moreover, she advocates for certain structural changes, such as paid maternity leave. These avowals of gender inequality, which I suggest can be understood as one of the signs marking the shift from a post-feminist moment to a feminist one, are overlaid by a much more profound and general disavowal. Now, Trump spends approximately 1 page of her 212-page book expounding on structural obstacles. The overwhelming majority of the advice and instruction given by Trump to less famous and wealthy women revolves around the labor individual women are required to invest in themselves in order to achieve success. Women who work can thus be read as exposing the processes through which aspirational women are interpolated as potentially capital-enhancing subjects. Through her constant exhortation that women invest in and work on all domains of their lives, Trump reveals, performs, and helps to reproduce the conversion of women from ostensible, autonomous, rights-bearing liberal subjects who need to fight discrimination in order to gain access to the marketplace to sell their labor, into subjects who must work tirelessly on themselves in order to produce and cultivate themselves as human capital. Moreover, this human capital, she intimates, must be maintained continuously. Every aspect of the self becomes a site of speculation, intense scrutiny, and affective investment. A process whose objective, again, is to increase and diversify the self's assets. to facilitate the self-appreciation, but just as importantly, to prevent the self-depreciation. This totalizing approach of the self as human capital serves then to facilitate the transformation of the self into a business enterprise, while simultaneously helping to further unravel the public-private divide. It is therefore not merely the economization of all domains of life under neoliberal rationality that collapses the liberal distinction between the private sphere of care and the public sphere of labor, rendering them interchangeable, but it is also what Michelle Farrer calls neoliberalism's apparatus of subjectivation that helps accelerate the eradication of this distinction. The neoliberal subject herself, recast as an individual firm, is compelled and encouraged to perceive every and all aspects of her life and herself, including reproduction and care work, as requiring continuous capital investment, ultimately rendering the separation of public-private unintelligible. In other words, as neoliberal rationality transforms more and more elements of society into enterprises informed by a business model with financialization at its heart, not only do all remaining private-public distinctions collapse, but the self itself becomes increasingly indistinguishable from any other kind of business enterprise, which ultimately undermines the very logic upholding the separation between the spheres. Trump's manifesto can thus be said to reveal, as well as enact, a twofold collapsing of traditionally distinct realms, the public versus the private, as well as one's enterprise versus oneself. So, following her prolonged introduction, Trump urges women to draft a personal mission statement, which he claims will pay certain dividends in the future by helping them to identify their passions and what she calls their true north. This exercise, in other words, will help them maximize their influence later on. After identifying what their passions are, preferably in their 20s, women are subsequently encouraged to enter the business or professional world and to cultivate a wide array of capabilities, such as networking and negotiating deals thoughtfully and effectively. These capabilities are considered key for increasing the probabilities of creating a successful enterprise and making one's mark. And yet, this is precisely the moment when the boundary between self and business become blurred, since the advice to foster these abilities, networking, negotiating skills, is meant to enhance not only the business one works on or runs, but also, and perhaps most crucially, the self itself. And this helps explain why women who work repeatedly insist that it is important for women who have begun to make their mark professionally to create their to-do charts, to, quote, prioritize their time so that they are always adding value, end quote. Planning well, which includes making endless lists about what women want to accomplish, from mission statements to everyday color-coded to-do lists, is central to ensuring that hard work will enhance value and yield the proper results. So the self becomes, in the words of Angela McRoby, a kind of neoliberal spreadsheet, indistinguishable from a business where one calculates one's assets, one's losses, and what is more or less valuable in order to decide where more capital investment in the form of developing entrepreneurial skills, resources, capacities is necessary. In women who work, the self is unashamedly transformed into an enterprise, and as such, there is no longer any need to presuppose a separation of the private from the public sphere. So the reconfiguration and collapse of the private-public divide is perhaps most evident as Trump includes domains traditionally and historically excluded from notions of, quote, boosting one's productivity and maximizing one's efficiency, end quote, in neoliberalism's calculative schema. Hobbies, friendships, and other intimate relationships that under neoliberalism were separate, at least conceptually, from a calculative matrix, are now carefully remade into forms of investment and value management. While the book merely intimates that decisions about who one dates and marries should also be part of this calculus, it explicitly encourages women to foster friendships and hobbies not as ends in and of themselves, but instead as part of the self as business's capital enhancing process. So when discussing the importance of networking for women just starting out in their career, Trump urges these women to make one new strong bond each time they meet if they meet people at a party or at a conference. Although, to be fair, there is some attempt to play down the instrumentalization of other people, the emphasis nonetheless is on the new contact or friend as beneficial for business as well as for enhancing one's own value. Indeed, both the cultivation of intimacies as well as self-care and leisure activities are transposed into business-like strategies, which also illustrates how neoliberal rationality and its subjective apparatus dissolve traditional forms of social ties and relations, even towards oneself. What we witness then is the economization of domains once closely associated with the non-market interests of the private sphere. And particularly striking is how affect, again, once inextricably linked to the domestic realm, has been transformed into its own form of asset or capital, which now requires smart investment so as to increase the probability of dividends in the future. One's affective attachments are perceived as forms of capital to be cultivated and invested in order to enhance the value of the self's overall portfolio. Indeed, savvy self-investment and entrepreneurial strategies of self-care have become paramount. In this way, Trump's How to Succeed book provides readers with a clear, and I would add, devastating vision of a world in which all spheres of human life and activity have been completely saturated, not only by a calculative reason, but also reconfigured by neoliberalism's moral imperative to appreciate, or at least to maintain, one's own market value as the ultimate aim in life. So, on the one hand then, women who work clearly exposes many of the processes through which subjects are required to remake themselves into various credit-seeking assets, endlessly working on themselves in order to increase their worth. Trump lays out in some detail the various kinds of temporal, physical, aesthetic, and affective investments that women must make in order to ensure that they can manage themselves successfully precisely as capital-enhancing subjects. So taking care of ourselves and professional development are, Trump insists, Taking care of ourselves in professional development are, Trump insists, things that we must prioritize so that we may become the best version of ourselves and achieve our goals. These activities are meant to maximize women's value. The text can therefore be said to encourage and further enact the conversion of aspirational women into generic rather than gendered human capital. In a sense, I suggest her text enacts the newest permutation of neoliberal feminism and one that may reveal the logical limits of this new variant of feminism. And this process is perhaps best exemplified in the refiguring of motherhood in managerial terms. Now, Trump does pay tribute to norms of intensive and hands-on motherhood, but at the same time, she provides various directives about how to better manage the caregiving role. She tells us that she writes lists for, quote, connecting with each of her kids, putting real thought into ideas for producing memorable moments, end quote, that she can create with them. Her approach to care is calculative and reads more like ticking off the right box in order to demonstrate correct investment for eventual returns in the form of future memories. She also informs her readers that she makes sure to have concrete family goals, which then enable her to pencil in time with her family. These goals include official date nights with her husband, dates that are scheduled into the general family list well in advance. In Women Who Work, the realm of care is transmogrified into regulated, calculative, and carefully planned affective investment. The way in which reproductive and care work is presented here, namely in more managerial terms, thus undermining in really interesting ways discourses of natural female nurturing instincts, gestures to the further saturation of a market metrics into domains that have traditionally upheld the gender division of labor, further attenuating the link between women, or to be more precise, a certain strata of women and care work. As a result, the ideal female self who Trump presents potentially challenges traditional notions of sexual difference. On the other hand, and crucially, the conversion of aspirational women into generic human capital remains incomplete, and not merely because women are the ones deemed responsible for imagining the to-do lists. Rather, Trump's normative trajectory still includes reproduction, while her ideal of female success remains a happy work-family balance, which is precisely why women who work should be considered a neoliberal feminist manifesto par excellence. Reproduction and care work continue to function as a kind of pushback to neoliberals' conversion of aspirational women into generic subjects. Moreover, even as Trump extends a market metrics to all domains of life, of women's life, thus contributing to the invisibilization of the gendered care infrastructure undergirding neoliberalism, in Trump's case through the outsourcing, of course, of this care to nannies and other domestic help, which he mentions perhaps once in the entire book. She repeatedly insists that she greatly values her role as wife to Jared Kushner. And this is interesting because this insistence not only aligns or realigns her with a certain familial traditionalism, but can also be understood to help buttress this pushback against the potential erasure of sexual difference. So in my larger project, I go into more detail about the contradictory aspects of Trump's text, suggesting that it discloses neoliberal feminism's conceptual or logical limit. Indeed, if reproduction and balance were not retained as part of Trump's discussion, then the transformation of aspirational women into generic human capital would be more or less complete, and neoliberal feminist discourse would disappear. It is precisely by through maintaining balance as part of its ideal on the one hand, while furthering the conversion of women into specks of capital through construing motherhood in managerial terms on the other, that neoliberal feminism appears to move closer toward its logical limit. So my main argument in this project is that neoliberal feminism has been operating as a kind of pushback to the total conversion of educated and upwardly mobile women into generic human capital. By paradoxically and counterintuitively maintaining reproduction as part of middle-class or so-called aspirational women's normative trajectory and positing balance as its ultimate ideal, neoliberal feminism helps to both maintain a discourse of reproduction and care work, while ensuring that all responsibility for these forms of labor, but not necessarily all the labor itself, not necessarily all the labor itself, falls squarely on the shoulder of these women. In this way, it solves its own constituent tension, the quandary of reproduction and care work, at least temporarily. Indeed, neoliberal feminism produces and maintains a distinctive and affective lexiconic register of reproductive and care work within neoliberalism, even as neoliberal rationality collapses the public-private divide. They also hypothesize that as reproductive technology develops, a certain strata of women will likely be able to outsource reproduction and care work more and more, thus ensuring the re-entrenchment of the so-called aspirational subject as generic human capital, while producing a whole other class of women who are conceived as not fully responsible lives and thus exploitable and dispensable or disposable. Furthermore, given the reality that most often women of color, poor, and immigrant women serve as the unacknowledged care workers who enable professional women to strive towards balance in their lives, neoliberal feminism actually helps to reproduce and legitimize the exploitation of these other women, other female subjects, while at the same time disarticulating the very vocabulary with which to address these vast inequalities. In this way, neoliberal feminism not only forsakes the majority of women by splitting female subjecthood into worthy and disposable women, but it also facilitates the creation of new and intensified forms of racialized and class stratified gender exploitation, which increasingly constitutes the invisible infrastructure of our neoliberal order. Now, in my book, I also compare Trump's text to the former Fox anchor woman and soon to be, or now the former NBC talk host, Megyn Keller's advice-oriented memoir, which is entitled Settle for More, and Anne Marie Slaughter's Unfinished Business, who is now the CEO of the think tank New America, which is a sequel of sorts to her Atlantic article, Why Women Still Can't Have It All, in order to underscore that women who work can can't be in any way considered an outlier. But due to time constraints, I'm not going to go into the detail about the comparison. I just want to highlight three things that emerge most strikingly when reading Trump in conjunction with Kelly and with Slaughter. First, all three espouse the by now familiar notion of a happy work-family balance as their ideal of female accomplishment. Second, all three texts ultimately place the responsibility for social change on individual women's shoulders. And finally, each one reflects and reproduces a cultural and political landscape in which more and more domains of life are being reduced to and understood through an economic frame. So now in the last minutes of my talk, and by way of conclusion, I want to return to some of my opening remarks very quickly, underscoring that the variant of feminism, neoliberal feminism, that I examine in my project in no way constitutes a threat to the powers that be. It effectively defangs feminism of its oppositional force by individualizing and responsibilizing women, and by helping neoliberal rationality resolve one of its constituent tensions by maintaining an affective register and distinctive lexicon of reproduction and care work. But at the same time, I want to suggest that the notion of a happy work-family balance as a feminist ideal has helped render this variant of feminism palatable and legitimate, which has then facilitated neoliberal feminism's widespread embrace and circulation within the Anglo-American mainstream cultural landscape. Indeed, precisely because neoliberal feminism incites individual women to, quote, internalize their revolution and focus on themselves and their own aspirations, thus buttressing neoliberalism's hegemony, it can more easily be popularized, sold, and capitalized upon the marketplace. And yet, this process of popularization may constitute a double-edged sword, since as Susan Buck-Morss has convincingly argued, power always produces its own vulnerability. So rather than ending on a pessimistic note, today is the election, I'd like to suggest that by facilitating feminism's widespread embrace, neoliberal feminism has also, and paradoxically, helped to pave the way for more militant and mass feminist movements, such as the Women's March and the Global Women's Strike. Clearly, much of the infrastructure for the recent oppositional feminist groundswell was already in place. We know that the Me Too campaign initially emerged over a decade ago as part of a grassroots movement spearheaded by the African-American activist Joanna Burke, and that it comes on the heels of other mobilizations such as Slut Walk. But what I want to suggest is that in addition to Trump's election and his now 4 years, and the reappearance of a shameless sexism in the public sphere, which has its own galvanizing effect, movements like Me Too were able to gain such widespread traction at this particular moment in history, at least in part because feminism had already been embraced and rendered desirable by high-power corporate women like Sheryl Sandberg, Hollywood stars like Emma Watson, as well as music celebrities like Beyonce, to name just a few. So taken together, these various feminist manifestations all suggest that we are experiencing a feminist renaissance of sorts. And I think we are at a crossroads, and I think we really are at a crossroads on all kinds of levels. So the urgent question then, from a feminist perspective, is how can we sustain and broaden this feminist renaissance as counter-hegemonic, as oppositional, and thus as a threat to the powers that be, while rejecting the neoliberal feminist logic informing how to succeed books and manifestos like Ivanka Trump's Women Who Work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for a tremendously interesting and stimulating lecture. And the questions, as expected, are coming in. And if you'd like to ask a question of our speaker, you can do so via Insights at Insights NCL, which is our Twitter handle, and also on the chat box on the YouTube page. The first question we have, Catherine, is, does class and race impact neoliberal feminism, do you think?
Thanks, Martin. Sort of strange to be live now, but yeah, it's an important question. And I think the way that I'd like to answer it is just to underscore that neoliberal feminism is an unabashedly exclusionary variant of feminism, in large part because it directs its attention and its address to so-called aspirational women. So that's women who are already or who already have a certain amount of social, cultural, and economic capital. And so its subject of address is basically upwardly mobile women. And so what that does, so that in turn enables neoliberal feminism to reify white and class privilege, but also heteronormativity. And heteronormativity comes in around the idea of a happy work-family balance. And this is true even as this new variant of feminism can accommodate women of color or queer or trans women, but only those who emulate this ideal of a happy work-family balance. So and another aspect to answering that question is that given our reality in which most often it's women of color, it's poor and immigrant women who are serving as the unacknowledged care workers, who are actually enabling professional women to strive towards balance in their lives. What neoliberal feminism does is it helps to reproduce and legitimize the exploitation of these other female subjects. So one of the ways that I talk about in my book is that neoliberal feminism not only forsakes the majority of women by splitting female subjecthood into worthy and disposable women, but it also sort of reproduces and legitimizes the exploitation of these other female subjects.
Thank you. Our next question: what do events such as the Me Too movement or International Women's Day protests tell us about resisting neoliberal feminism's concepts?
So, I mean, I think one of the things to remember when thinking about the challenges to neoliberal feminism is what neoliberal feminism is and what it does. And so neoliberal feminism is this form of feminism that disavows our socioeconomic and cultural structures that shape our lives, and thus has abandoned key feminist terms such as liberation and social justice. And so when thinking about how or in what ways do these protests and campaigns resist neoliberal feminism, I think we need to keep that in mind. So in so much as these movements challenge or begin to talk and critique systemic race, systemic sexism, then in a sense it's resisting neoliberal feminism concepts. But I also would say that Me Too and the International Women's Day protests are very different. So if we think about the Women's Day March, which began in order to protest Trump's election, and here we are on election night again, and that march and what became an international demonstration consciously was an international feminist demonstration or protest, and it did have institutional and structural critiques of feminism and other kinds of systemic oppressions. So in that way, it is a very different, kind of feminist movement than neoliberal feminist movements. Well, there are no neoliberal feminist movements, so we can talk about that a little bit.
I'm interested to know how your experience of this as a teacher. I mean, how have your students reacted to this, and how have those responses changed over the last 4 years?
That's really interesting because one of the things that I found teaching, I've taught feminist theory for over a decade. And one of the things that I've noticed over the decade is when I first went into the classroom, and I was teaching actually in Ben-Gurion University in Israel, is that students, women, and mostly women, most of the courses were, the students were women, would, when I asked them if they identified as feminist, would not raise their hands. And what I've seen over time is that, and especially now as I'm teaching in Nottingham, well, not this year, but last year when I was teaching my Introduction to Feminist Theory course, is that the majority of women will now identify themselves as feminists. And then when we start to analyze and sort of go through and define the different, there's not one feminism, there are lots of different feminisms. We begin to sort of unpack what feminism means and the history of feminisms, mostly in the United States. They begin to understand that their identification was based on this kind of popular feminism, which I claim is sort of a legacy of the emergence and the entrenchment of neoliberal feminism. So it has And I find it a very exciting time in terms of teaching feminism because it has been made popular in various ways. And so there's a different kind of discussion.
I mean, I don't know anything like the lengths that you teach or the depths that you teach, but I've noticed that students are much less likely to caveat or add qualifiers to the term than they were 10 years ago, which I think is reflecting your experience as well. Question from a member of the audience, from Lisa, in fact. Why does neoliberal feminism place reproductive labour solely on the shoulders of women, if it does not see caring as a biological trait of women?
Well, this is exactly the kinds of paradoxes that I was attempting to examine in my book, right? So one of the things that one of the interesting or contradictory aspects of this rise of what I would later call neoliberal feminism was precisely, on the one hand, this conversion of women into generic human capital, on the other, that notions and discourses of reproduction continued. And so there is not in neoliberalism any sense of an essential femininity or essential that women are essentially caring. And that's where the neoliberal feminism comes in. It's a way of broaching the question and maintaining this lexicon and a vocabulary around care and reproductive work. And what better way, given that neoliberalism is about individualizing and responsibilizing subjects, but to sort of create a discourse in which the responsibility for care work precisely falls on individual women's shoulders. So that was the contradiction or the tension within neoliberalism that I was trying to solve. And the way that I claimed that it solved it, at least temporarily, was precisely by creating a rhetoric of neoliberal feminism.
Heather asks, on a question of surrogacy, part of outsourcing reproduction, as you say, can it ever be good for women in general for this to be legal? It's currently illegal in many countries.
That's a really tricky question in terms of surrogacy. And I think that my answer to surrogacy is that it's like many of these outsourcing mechanisms for reproductive and care work are incredibly problematic for the ways in which they often they outsource to the global south, and there's lots of exploitation that's involved in surrogacy. Now, the question of whether there could be surrogacy in which those kinds of exploitations didn't occur, that's a different kind of question, and that question could only be answered in a society in which this kind of exploitation didn't occur. So I guess that would be my way. It's a very, very complicated question. People work on surrogacy from a feminist perspective. So yeah.
That's great, thank you. And we were chatting before, and I realised this wasn't something that you spoke about, but I'm just curious if you have a view about it. This is a research interest of mine, and one of the research I've read on the subject of Margaret Thatcher as an example of a masculinized woman and how much she stands as a feminist icon. And there's a great debate within British conservatism and British female conservatives discussing whether or not she is, and indeed most British feminists would say that she wasn't, but there's a heated debate that's been going on for many years. Do you happen to have a view on the subject?
I mean, the whole question of what it means to be a masculinized leader, is that because she's embodying certain kinds of masculinist norms, right?
Yeah.
And I think that whole discourse is problematic is a problem for various reasons. In terms of whether she's a feminist icon, it depends on how you understand feminism and whether you think that representation where women are in power is necessarily or translates into a feminist mode. So is representation enough? My view is that representation is important, but it's never enough, so that it has to do also with policies that are enacted. And if those policies are misogynistic, or if they are undermining the material conditions that allow women to thrive in society, then it's problematic to say that she is a feminist icon. I think it's much. I mean, the idea of representation and identity politics are very complicated when you're thinking about Margaret Thatcher as a feminist icon. Women in power, we know, are often carrying. They often, and here I can think about in Israel, Golda Meir, right? They can be very right-wing and can really pursue policies that are disproportionately affect women in a very bad way.
Since it's election night, I wonder on your thoughts on the extent to which this affected Hillary Clinton 4 years ago and the very likely chance we'll have of Kamala Harris as the Democrats' candidate in 4 years' time. Is that an exciting prospect, or has the nature of discourse around them been rather upsetting?
Now, the election in the US, and one of the reasons that I'm a little frazzled right now is because I'm in a lot of stress and anxiety about what's going to happen. And it's not because I'm a great Biden or Democrat fan. And I have to say that outright. I think that where a lot of progressives on the left are, both in terms of your question, is that we now know what 4 years of Trump looks like, and we need to do what we can in order to ensure that there are not another 4 years. It's not just about the U.S. And what's happening in the U.S. It's about climate catastrophe. We need Biden and Harris to win. So I'm not sure that I would say it's again, it's about representation and whether we think the fact that a woman of color is in office necessarily translates into a feminist mode or moment, which it does on the one hand. But again, for me, it's not enough in so much as the policies need to also translate into things that would enable the majority of women to and everybody to thrive in society.
We'll know soon. I mean, this is live, but of course people will be watching this lecture in days and weeks and months to come, and we'll know the outcome of what's happening this evening. But as far as your talk's been concerned, it's been a tremendous contribution to the programme. Thank you very much, Catherine, for your presence here this evening. Yes, indeed. Thank you to our questioners. And our next event is on Thursday, the 5th of November, and it's the rescheduled World Mental Health Day lecture by Adam Gridley. There and back again, a journey through mental illness. Hope you can join us then. Thank you and good night.